I've got my hands on all three of the new M1 powered Macs, the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro, and the Mac Mini. I'm going to tell you whether or not you should be an early adopter. The big news is that Apple is switching all of their Macs from Intel chips to their own Apple Silicon chips, otherwise known as M1. It's the biggest platform change for Macs since they switched from PowerPC chips to Intel chips way back in 2006, and those were among the very first laptops I ever reviewed for CNET, which means I've been doing this a long time. So now I've gotten to see the very first Intel Macs, and I've also apparently seen the very last Intel Macs because I now have the first versions of the Apple M1 Macs. I've got a new M1 MacBook Air, a new M1 MacBook Pro, and the new M1 Mac Mini. And these range in price from $699 to the Mini. The Air is, as usual, still $999, and the Pro is $1299. Now, the really interesting thing here is that all three of those Apple devices have essentially the same M1 chip in them. It's not like you're buying an Air and getting a Core i3 and buying a Pro and getting a Core i5. They've all got the one version of the M1. The only real difference is the base model MacBook Air, that $999 MacBook Air. It's got 7 GPU cores instead of 8 GPU cores, although they all have the 8 CPU cores. And when I did some benchmark testing on all three of these systems and compared them to previous Intel Macs, the three new M1 versions all performed roughly the same, and they all performed much better than the older Intel versions, even though I was testing Intel MacBooks from just earlier in 2020, not really very old ones at all. Now, this could come in handy if you're doing a lot of video editing or high-end photo editing or trying to do 3D creation on your Mac. You'd say, of course, I want more power for the same money. That makes perfect sense to me. Now, the downside is whenever you switch platforms like this, all the software that people run under Intel or AMD-powered laptops, whether they're Windows or Mac ones, the architecture for the M1 chip is closer to ARM-based things like you'd find in a lot of tablets and phones and a handful of Windows laptops, ARM-based Windows laptops, which frankly so far have not particularly impressed me. And there were lots of compatibility issues. A lot of apps that you use just wouldn't work. Now for the Apple version with M1, they've taken a lot of care. First of all, performance is very good. Secondly, battery life is fantastic. We're really seeing some great battery life gains. In fact, Apple says you should get like 18 hours of video playback from the Air and 20 hours from the Pro. In my video streaming test, which is a little tougher than Apple's, I got 16 hours and 41 minutes out of the Air. I'm still testing the Pro, but that's a really good improvement, especially for people who feel like they don't want to, have to carry around their power cable with them all the time. It's kind of like a phone or an iPad. You charge it up, you leave it there to charge up, and then once you pick it up, you don't take the charger with you, which should be good all day. And these Macs are finally ones that give you that sense. Now, depending on what software you're using, you're either going to get an M1 native version of that software. Apple calls it a universal app, so it'll work on any Mac equally well. And there's only a handful of those native for M1 software programs right now. A lot of them are Apple's own programs. A few of them, like Microsoft Office and DaVinci Resolve, which is a video editing program, they're in beta right now, but you can get the beta versions if you look around. Other apps are going to have to run through what's called Rosetta. It's actually Rosetta 2. The original Rosetta was for that PowerPC to Intel translation. So Rosetta basically takes the program you're running and emulates it as if it were running on an Intel chip instead of the M1 chip. And when I installed some Photoshop and Illustrator and other Adobe apps on these systems, I'd get the pop-up message saying, hey, we're going to use Rosetta to run this. Hope that's cool. And then I would get a separate warning message from Adobe saying, you're still using the Intel-based version of this while we work on the Apple M1 native version. Now, the M1 native version of Lightroom, a popular Adobe app, is coming in December. The M1 versions of like Photoshop and Illustrator and Premiere, they're not coming till next year. And that's probably the single biggest concern I have about these new M1 Macs, because those are such mission critical apps for so many people. I would have kidnapped a bunch of Adobe engineers and locked them in a basement over at the Apple Spaceship campus to make sure that I had Photoshop running natively on day one. That said, I was able to run these apps on these new M1 systems, and they ran about as well as they do on the Intel versions, but not necessarily better. One area where they did run better is when I tried the M1 native version of DaVinci Resolve, which again is a video editing program, not one I usually use, but I played around with it a bit. I put some 4K clips that I had shot for a previous review of the Xbox Series X in, and I just did a bunch of quick cuts and threw on a whole bunch of goofy transitions just to see what would happen when you tried to preview it in real time. On an old Intel MacBook Air, it really stuttered. It couldn't preview it in 4K for me. It couldn't really preview it that well in even 1080 for me, and that's what I would expect from a MacBook Air. On the M1 versions, on the Mac Mini and on the MacBook Air, it could mostly do the 4K preview version. It got caught up on a couple of the more intensive transitions. When I switched to previewing it in 1080, then it ran super smooth. So I'm very pleased in the video editing process so far and what these new M1 versions can do versus the video editing performance you'd get on, frankly, a very consumer system like an Intel MacBook Air previously. So Apple is making a lot of promises about these M1 systems, that they're faster. I find that is generally true so far in my early benchmark hands-on testing. I've only had these for a couple of days. They talk a little bit about gaming. I have not been successful getting a lot of games to run yet. Hopefully more and more games will work either with Rosetta or become native Apple Silicon apps. And they made big claims about battery life, which again in my testing so far I have found to be true. Now, you don't always want to be an early adopter, especially if you're doing mission-critical Creative Pro stuff like photo and video editing and 3D, where the apps you need you're going to have to run in an emulated mode or wait for the real versions. I might hang off a little bit on that. If you were about to buy a MacBook Air anyway because you need a machine to carry around that'll last all day and do all that stuff a MacBook Air does really well, like using online tools and email and social media and streaming video and just being your all-day, everyday, regular guy or gal laptop, well, this new M1 version seems to do all that very well and runs for a lot longer per charge. And even better, it's now fanless, which is something really the Air should have been for a long time. That means that it's power efficient enough that it can just use an aluminum heat spreader inside. It doesn't need a separate fan to keep it cool. Even though it's the same M1 chip for the most part in the MacBook Pro and the Mac Mini, you can conceivably get longer sustained peak power out of those because they have active cooling systems in them, by which I mean they have a fan. So that's the one thing to keep in mind differentiating these two systems. Of these, the $999 MacBook Air feels like a better deal right now than the $1299 MacBook Pro because frankly they're pretty identical. They both have almost the same M1 chip. They both have just 8 gigs of RAM and a 256 gig hard drive. So maybe I would get the Air and spend a couple $100 upgrading the RAM and the hard drive space rather than spending more on the Pro to start, where you do get a slightly brighter screen, you get active cooling in it, you have the touch bar if you're a touch bar fan, and I'm sure they're out there. But maybe the best value overall is that Mac Mini. It's $699, so it remains the least expensive way to get into Mac OS, and its performance was the same, in some cases even a little bit better than the MacBook Pro, which costs almost twice as much. Of course, we are continuing to test all these new Macs, the M1 Mac Mini, the M1 MacBook Air, and the M1 MacBook Pro, and we are going to report back to you when we've got new battery life scores, new benchmark scores, and new app compatibility issues to talk about. All right, that's it.